put up some slides, and then I'm going to talk for about 40-45 minutes. If you have a clarifying question, ask Sajal, and we'll, get that way. Just paste it in the chat. So we were talking about this cartoon. This is Donnelly, who does cartoons for the New Yorker, and they did a cartoon of me, and I thought that was cool, so I put that on the opening slide. So the outline of what I'm going to talk about is sort of the computational social science view of societal decision making, what goes into good decision making, inequality and dangers. And then I want to talk a little bit about practical steps, because I spend a lot of my time doing things that result in policy. And I've been pretty good at it in terms of actually getting things to change. So I want to start with this, as this is very commonly used as the mathematics of decision making. And the core problem is do you stick with known bets, things that are generating value for you, or do you try new things? Exploitation, exploration. And this is known as foraging in the animal literature. Do you go to the place where you know there's food, or do you search for other alternate sources just in case? And this is obviously a Bayesian formulation. You look at the likelihood that this particular strategy you're thinking about is a good one. You multiply that by a prior from the previous trials that you've done. So how well has it worked in the past? And then you get a posterior, which you can then use to be able to choose whether or not to carry out this policy. Now, there's a couple of questions. One is do you place all your bets on one choice, the posterior, the maximum, or do you allocate several bets against the different possibilities proportional to the posterior? And sort of simple risk analysis shows you should be having multiple bets, not a single bet. That's called probability matching. And a question that always comes up is, where do you get this magic prior? And so that's the mathematics of it. That has nothing to do with people. This is the thing that underlies portfolio theory, lots of different things. It really works. What people do is they, of course, look at the features in front of them. We have a limited capacity to reason about things, so we don't look very far ahead or very completely. But for the prior, we do something interesting. What we do is we look at the choices that are most popular around us. We use other people for our prior. So we get that from people. And we had a paper in Cognition that's coming out actually in a month or so about this. And then we use this probability matching. Humans use this probability. We bet on more than one thing, at least as a collective. Each person might pick one, but as a collective, you see the probability of each choice is proportional to the posterior. So this is nice because it uses limited cognitive capacity, and you get an enormous acceleration by using the experience of other people. Okay? Now, let's look at those things. So using the other people turns out to be a really good strategy. So this is data from 100,000 people in a mid-income country. And what we did is we looked at how many different communities they interact with and plotted that against their income. And you can see if you interact with more different types of people, you make more money. And there's a Nature Communications citation for that. We have several other things like this, showing this on all 4 continents that are heavily populated. Now, you might ask, is this causal? But this is like the weak tie theory. So, looking for opportunities requires looking to people that are different than you, right? And there's a variety of data and experiments that show that this is at least part of the causal structure of wealth creation. But and this is a paper that we recently had in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, there's a problem with this. And that is that individuals are not very good at this. That's why we use the social priors. If you just pick the people at random, you can pretty regularly beat individuals. This is why we use teams for all sorts of decision making. But if you really want to be good, what you do is you have to take teams of people who have similar values, similar utilities, similar goals as you, okay? Because obviously if you're in a team and somebody wants to do exactly the opposite of what you do, then that's going to bias the decision making and so forth. But what I just said is diversity helps you find new opportunities, but quality of decisions comes from interacting with people who are very similar. And in the mathematical biology literature, this is known as a reaction diffusion equation. And what it does is it breaks a population, a network, into small globules of similar people, even if it started off very mixed. So this is why you see some of the classic models of segregation, why not just that it happens, but what are the driving forces? It's this decision quality benefits from similar people versus the ideas and trade that benefit that comes from diversity. So trading those off requires a non-homogeneous structure. And that's the math behind the things that we observe, which is segregation. This is a persistent source of segregation, not one that's done from arbitrary history or something like this. This is something that will exist for all time because it's based in these very basic qualities of decision making and the conflicts of exploitation versus exploration, which is shared by all species and in fact any social agents. So these segregated networks, of course, mean that knowledge and opportunities diffuse slowly between groups. There's a citation for it. And what that means is that the inequality is not just around one decision. So if somebody had some especially good piece of information or opportunity, but that it will compound over time. So you get these persistent types of inequality. Again, just purely as a matter of the network structure. This has nothing to do with culture. It has nothing to do with much more about humans other than we try to approximate this mathematically optimal in the sense of minimum regret strategy. It has real consequences, though. So this is one from another group up the river from us, opportunityinsights.org. These people got a hold of amazing information from the Internal Revenue Service. And what you find is that if a young child, so we're talking less than 10 years old, is exposed to a male inventor, someone who has, created their own business, come up with some sort of innovation, it makes them dramatically more likely to become an innovator themselves if they're male. And it actually has a somewhat negative effect on the girls. If it's a female innovator, that does nothing for the males, the boys, but it has a huge effect on the life history, the life prospects for the girls. So it's this sort of connection for opportunities, this exposure to other things that fails because of segregation, that gives rise to intergenerational failures in intergenerational mobility. Again, this is not something that has to do with laws or particulars of the human nature or history. This is a basic consequence of the way you have a social species, any social species, has to keep itself alive while looking for new opportunities. That promotes directly segregation. Segregation means you don't learn how to do things the same way. So in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a great hope for digital media. Digital media could solve this because they're not segregated, right? Everybody can see Twitter or whatever, right? And so we did a couple of big studies of that where we had shopping data for people. Where do they go to shop? Where do they go to work, play, things like that? And what do they do online? And you could read the papers if you want the details. But the bottom line of it is the stuff you do online is just as segregated as the stuff you do physically. So rich people talk to rich people, poor people talk to poor people. They don't talk to each other online, when shopping, or when working. They just don't. It's like we live in the same spot. We have the same digital media. We don't talk to each other. The only notable asymmetry here is that almost rich people have a preference for talking to rich people, but rich people hate talking to almost rich people. But other than that, it's just, online segregation seems to be driven by the topics, the things that happen, by physical, experienced segregation. Again, that makes inequality persistent, and it's something that you can't fix easily through digital media. So the dangers to good decision making are things like the wrong facts. So we had a lot of attention to that recently. And I would point out that we almost always, in the news and the media, confuse facts with interpretations. So it's actually not very clear that we confuse the facts very often, but we are very, very biased, segregated, inconclusive about the interpretations. So X happened. Yeah, okay. But those evil people did it. Or no, those heroes of the country did it. Those are the interpretations. All of this confusion of interpretations versus facts, of course, faking facts, picking facts, is a danger to good decision making. But I said that people use this social prior. And so marketing, making you think that everybody thinks this way, is an enormous danger to good decision making. It's the phenomena of echo chambers. I know my own kids were absolutely convinced that Bernie Sanders was going to win the presidential election, both times. That's because everybody they talked to was a Bernie supporter. Right? It's just like, no, boys and girls, not going to happen. But this is also, of course, and this is scary, is something that political parties do. So the Cambridge Analytica scandal, of course. But I happen to know Obama's digital campaign manager, and they got the same data from Facebook, but Facebook just gave it to them. So they did the same things. And in fact, it's been going on now for almost 15 years that we've been using things where we're micro-targeting people in the political process. Well, what does that do? Well, that biases this prior. And then the posterior, making the decision, a lot of the things that we do in our current democratic system are wrong in that way. So it's not a good idea in making good decisions to place only one bet. You want diversities. You want more resources on the most likely one, the one with the highest posterior, less on ones with lower posteriors. But it's generally a mistake to bet everything on the most likely thing. This is why hedge funds, by wealth funds, by retirement funds, spread the risk. Because nothing in the world is certain. You need to place your bets proportional to what you think will be a payoff. And so you can see where our current situation is falling down on the wrong facts, on the sort of marketing echo chamber aspect, and where the posterior, the decisions, are made a little bit too black and white. So the cartoon version of democracy is independent individuals deciding on one course of action. And you can see what's wrong with that. Individuals are not independent. They use these social priors, which means they're amenable to marketing and social influence, even if it's a secret ballot. And making a decision is the wrong thing to do anyhow. Uniformity in decision-making is the enemy of long-term success. So let's look at what the situation is with these. So this is work by one of my colleagues, David Rand. So he looked at trust of data sources among rather extreme Republicans and rather extreme Democrats. And what you can see is that everybody can tell what fake news is. Those are those sort of red ones, and the yellow ones are sort of hyper-partisan. Republicans trust the sort of mainline things a little less than Democrats, but you can see that people know which things are more likely to be trustworthy, and they agree across party lines. So what he concludes is that when we look at social media, we're being lazy, not stupid. So we like to tweet things that are adrenaline-provoking. The whole industry of media is based on selling clicks, on advertising. So they want you to get angry. They want you to be whatever. And that's why we have so much of the extreme media and relatively little of the sort of more analytical, fast-paced. Remember what I said about facts versus interpretations. Marketing and echo chamber. So I like this. This is a website called More in Common that comes out of the University of Pennsylvania. And it shows error in understanding the other polarized group. So this happens to be Democrats, but there's a similar one for Republicans. And what the error is measured by, how much can you predict what the other side will say? How accurate are you if you're a Democrat predicting Republicans, if you're a Republican predicting Democrats? And it turns out that people with post-grad education that are Democratic are dramatically worse than people who didn't finish high school who are Democratic. And the hypothesis is, and there's considerable evidence for this, is that if you're highly educated and Democratic, you have very few Republican friends. Whereas if you didn't finish high school, you're probably in a blue-collar situation where you have many Republican friends. So again, exposure, echo chambers, are something that biases decision-making rather strongly. The final thing I pointed to in that equation was making only one bet. And this is the difference between resilient systems versus rigid systems. If you make only one bet, you always have a certain probability of losing, and odds are you will lose sometime when you do repeated betting. If you spread your bets, you may lose, but you're not going to have a completely destroyed portfolio. Evolution, for instance, makes many bets and uses feedback loops to limit or remove the bets that don't work poorly. This is speciation, right? In the EU, people complain about one side fits none. That's where you get Brexit and other sort of things. And they're working hard to make a more diverse set of EU countries, and we're helping them with that. And in the US, you see a lot of dissatisfaction by having federal global rules that go against local norms. Of course, that makes the local community unhappy. Again, it's sort of like this one-size-fits-none that you see in the EU. So what are some practical steps? Well, there's a thing I call the New Deal on Data. This is the paper I wrote that started the GDPR discussion, and we've just built on it over the years. You need better facts. And to get that, you need to have data in the hands of lots of stakeholders, not just Google, Facebook, and the government. There needs to be a whole discussion about facts. You need better social perception, so we need trusted measurements of social factors. Where is the poverty? What is the level of inequality? Is this sustainable? You know, these are all obviously important things, but the amount that we know about them is remarkably little. We measure everything in GDP. That is very familiar to people. Other measurements are not, and as a consequence, we miss a lot of the character of what's happening and make it very difficult to tell what's working and what's not. And the third thing, and this is all driven by the structure of that equation, which incidentally is called Thompson sampling, Bayesian-Thompson sampling. The need to be experimental. You have to try multiple things to avoid the piling all your bet on one thing. So communities should be able to try different things, and within guidelines, obviously, but to see which policies actually work, and they may work different policies in different parts of the country. So better facts, I mentioned a couple times that this idea was behind the GDPR, the European privacy regulations. Better measures. I ran a series of large-scale national experiments in principally Africa, but some in the EU, that ended up shaping the Sustainable Development Goals. You should Google "A World That Counts." You'll see the report from that. And now I work with the EU to cure this one-size-fits-none problem by allowing more variability within the EU alliance. The core for making this happen is, in my view, control of data, use of data, analytics that support better decision making. And to do that, you're going to need new institutions. So this is not novel. In the late 1800s in the US, a few big banks were taking unfair advantage of farming communities. And the farming communities said, yeah, we're just going to start our own banks. And that led to the modern banking system. So if you think of money like data, data like money, so what happened is local communities said, yeah, we're going to guide our own future using this new resource. In the 1900, 1920 sort of area, labor became a key means of production. Something that was called out, and a few big corporations were abusing the citizenry, and they formed into unions, local things at first, later global, but they took control of these means of production to be able to establish new rules that were fair for everybody. And so I think the same thing is beginning to happen now. We're seeing data unions, which are communities taking control of their data to be able to make better decisions. We have a paper about that in Sloan Management Review. And it's worth noticing that the EU now will require things like data unions as part of its 2021 data regulations. So in other words, instead of giving data, selling data the way we have today, it will be selling insights under the control of the people who own the data. So think of these as like credit unions or labor unions, data unions. And the California privacy law also specifically empowers these to happen. And what I'm doing is I'm beginning to work with a number of entities. So we're helping the Credit Union Association, particularly in poorer communities, disperse loans to the communities, where the communities now have much more data about their situation and have the ability, therefore, to make better decisions. Working with Consumers Union, who helped us get better products, safer products. Now we're working to get safer data, data that's in the interest of the people, not just the interest of the companies. Open Music is an example of, in this case, musicians owning their own data. So we've built a system for that that's being considered and tested. It's being deployed by the largest music schools, and the characteristic is it gives musicians much more ownership over their digital data, which they call music, and the ability to license it. And similarly, working with gig workers to be able to know more about their situation so that they can detect things that are unfair, bargain with these big new digital companies, and so forth. So just to make that concrete, here is a result, computational social science result we got. Turns out that the diversity of stores in a neighborhood, this is in a community, is a highly accurate predictor of year-on-year growth, independent of population, investment, education, et cetera, et cetera. Accounts for almost half of the variance. So that's a dramatic improvement in being able to assess year-on-year economic growth. And the driver is diversity of stores. Diversity of stores almost perfectly predicts diversity of people, incidentally, which is correlated with individual wealth. And so what we're doing, there's the citation. So what we're doing is we're building tools to help local business workers, local businesses, make better choices. And we're doing this in Australia, beginning in the UK, beginning in Canada, and those other examples were in the US. So this is an example from Australia where this woman has started some child care centers, wants to find a new place to put a child care center, but needs to have data about what is the competition, what's the physical space availability, safety of the area, are there employees who are going to work for her? And so what we've done is built a tool that aggregates the community's data to be able to give her displays to help her make choices inside in her new child care facility. Another aspect of this, which I think is worth mentioning, is that trusted data enables access to justice. If you don't know what people are doing to you, it's hard to get justice from it. And as someone who was on the advisory committee of the American Bar Association, I was sort of upset that people didn't understand that it's hard for people to advocate for themselves if they don't know their situation. So I set up a thing called law.mit.edu, which is an alliance of law schools, to think about how access to data, computation, changes the nature of law. And there's a sort of inaugural paper that I wrote about this. And as was mentioned, I just finished a book called Building the New Economy. There's it's a work in progress on the MIT Press website, so it's free online. You can read it. It'll be out in Kindle and so forth soon. And with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pentland, for a very insightful talk. So let's just give a big hands, since we are not able to welcome you to campus and host you to have more interaction. So are you open for the questions now? So I can actually
yeah, absolutely.
ask. So the first person to ask the question is Ardhendu Tripathi, is a computer science faculty. Ardhendu, you are.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thank you, Professor Pentland, for the very nice talk and overview. I agree on a lot of aspects that you touched upon, and that new problems need new solutions. I was wondering about how you started off with essentially motivating the need for segregation in an advanced society. And I was wondering, like you talked about the reaction diffusion model, right? And how that sort of led to these globs of similar, I don't know what to call them, organisms or cells. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, well, that's a biological sort of petri dish, but as humans, is it possible that we have segregated communities, but they're segregated more by function, whereas the membership, that is the people making those communities, changes over time? So
I don't see any reason not to have something like that. In fact, it's a mistake that you segregate people by surface appearance or simple sort of demographics. It's really this sort of functional. You want people who want the same things as you to form a group. So chambers of commerce, cooperatives, church groups, all are expressions of what you just said, and they can change over time and do. And the more they reach out to each other, so we're talking about communities of practice, communities of culture, communities of interest, the more they reach out to each other, the better they can do. They can begin sharing opportunities, sharing ideas. And so it's this sort of process of harvesting ideas by talking to very different people, and then winnowing them by talking to people who share your values. But obviously that can change, and if you're talking about work, that's different than talking about kids' education. It might be a completely different community. In fact, our work shows that physical segregation is probably not the most important element of segregation, for instance, in the United States or other places. It's really cultural factors. It's habits that we have that keep us isolated or prevent other people from coming in more than the obvious physical things. Not that the physical things are good, but that there is hope by promoting a culture of essentially sort of innovation and having your gang to help you figure out what to do and support you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the answer.
So, Sandy, before I ask the next person to a question, so a related question that about the segregation, now the gentrification that is happening in many cities and urban areas. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're doing with this law.mit.edu is making legal contracts that allow you to avoid gentrification in the following sense. In the current financial situation with low interest rates, it's entirely possible to have, for instance, build an apartment building where instead of paying rent, low-income people take what would have been rent and use that to buy the unit that they live in. And the investor who put in the original money gets bought out fairly quickly. So the investor makes good money still. But it ends up after 5-10 years that it's the community that owns it, not the investor. And that's sort of one of the fundamental things in avoiding gentrification. The other one is starting businesses. Gentrification goes along with diversity of stores, new businesses, that sort of buzz. And the problem, of course, is that it's people outside the community that own those stores. So by helping local people start stores, start amenities that help create that positive boost in the community, you end up with a community that's richer, but also the citizens are richer. So, you know, this is not like an absolute fix, but it's surprising. So we're actually, one of our guys is building apartment complexes in Kansas City using this, where the people, it's a sort of low-cost housing. The people who live there will end up owning it after 5-10 years.
Wonderful. The next question is posed by Dr. Genda Chen in Civil Engineering faculty. So, Genda.
Hi, Professor Pentland. Thank you for very informative and inspiring presentation. I'm civil engineering, but I was exposed to AI expert system 30 years ago when I was PhD student. So I was excited with the data things over the years. So in particular, I was very interesting to hear the new data and aggregation about different diversity areas. So this is the first time I heard the data. But I'm going to ask you a different question. Because you are NAE members, I would like to see your thought about a different solution to global warming. You mentioned in the introduction, if we act together, we can get that resolved. I absolutely agree. Recently, UN report indicate actually the most cost-effective approach to control the warming is to change our diet instead of a science, because the factory farm cause problem with methane emission, water pollution, land depletion, and also world hunger. We feed grain to animal instead of hungry people worldwide. Is there any conversation at the NAE level regarding to this science versus responsibility, like a citizen?
Yeah, well, there is conversation at the NAE, but I'm going to refer you to the World Economic Forum discussion or the World Leaders discussion, both of which, I'm part of. And I think the one that is most interesting to think about is that the way we do science and translate it into policy is broken because science likes to concentrate on one factor. It's very siloed. We talk about CO2. But there's also a problem with water. There's a problem with soils. There's a problem, as you say, with the sort of food cycle. There's a problem with plastic. There's many problems that argue that you need a much more holistic approach than is typical of the siloing you see in academia. It's really the ecology that's out of whack. And all these things are symptoms of the underlying disequilibrium, okay? And I mean, just to sort of follow your point but make it a little different, I remember a recent World Economic Forum session, global session, that was opened by Prince Charles. So I would never sort of thought I would look to Prince Charles for inspiration, but he was pointing out that if you put money and effort into reconstructing farmland and forests, and you took a lot of the money we spend currently and put it towards that, which involves many of the things you're just talking about, because the pricing of that will change and make food much less meat intensive when you do that. Then you could have put an enormous dent into global warming, into the water table problems, into the soils. I didn't know anything about plastic, but maybe we can sort of help about that. Because, like, for instance, in the US, I think it's somewhere between a third and a half of our topsoil has disappeared in the last century or so. And that stuff stores carbon like mad. It stores water and it cleans it and does things. So that's part of sort of a bigger slice of this ecosystem being out of balance. And what I happen to like about that solution is that would be something that both Republicans and Democrats would probably support. So it's actually something you could do, potentially. Right? I keep waiting for someone to make that part of the political discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Ava, you are the next.
Hi. So I have a couple of questions, actually. One is, do you see any phenomena such as genetic drift with respect to ideological diversity, like the Wright fission model? And the second question was related to your earlier hypothesis that, well, the correlation with respect to high income or income and kind of interaction with different, more diverse group, with individuals which interact with more diverse group. But isn't it be the case that people with higher income will have the opportunity to interact with a more diverse group since they will have more mobility?
So let's take the second one first.
Mm-hmm.
So this notion of people making more money or becoming more prosperous. And I was pointing out that people who interact with more diverse communities are more prosperous, and you're saying, oh, but it could be the other way around. And I think the evidence is, at all sorts of scales, is that it's both ways. the way I pointed out is sort of the theory of weak ties, and there are situations where you can see, like we've been able to show that that's causal in certain situations, like the spread of certain industries or the spread of technology or things like that. But it's certainly the case that people who are more wealthy end up having more diverse things. In fact, there's a slightly cynical view of colleges, which is that the main function of colleges is to give us a language that allows us to collaborate across different communities. And we could say more about that if you want. But so it's a feedback loop, just like diverse stores predicting growth in income in the neighborhood. That's a feedback loop. Diverse stores attract diverse people enable new opportunities for yet more amenities. That attracts investors, which means more diverse stores, and so it's a cycle. And so it's no one causal thing. But in dealing with a problem like this, that is this sort of dynamic feedback loop, what you have to do is you have to say, what are the most important parts of that loop, and try to leverage those. And we have enough data, enough experiments to show that both directions are causal. But the one that's typically ignored is this one that has to do with diverse communities, diverse amenities. Like if you look through the literature, there's very little about that. But yet, looked at from that perspective, that accounts for 50% of the variance. It's huge. It's bigger than everything else put together. And so it's almost certainly something, or some version of this, that's a serious causal process. And it doesn't matter exactly how you measure the diversity. It could be communities, could be job types, could be many different types of things. It all works pretty much the same. Works on every continent we've looked at, 4 continents so far. So I'm just sort of advocating that really, and this is in line with the stuff at the beginning, what humans are involved in is foraging for new opportunities. Foraging, and it's not the sort of standard economic model where you're at equilibrium. We're always out of equilibrium. And we're foraging for new things to do. What's the next thing to do while you're still keeping yourself alive? That's the point of that very first equation, that Thompson sampling, that portfolio management thing. And when you look at it that way, well, of course, looking for different types of people, different communities, new types of solution is something that produces additional wealth. But it's also the case that if you have more resources, you can do that better. And in fact, the paper I cited earlier in the presentation shows that, for instance, in this is a lower income country, it's a mid-income country now, mid-income country in South Asia that has a caste system. So the benefit from diversity for upper caste people is greater than the benefit from lower caste people. And what that argues is that it is exactly that sort of reverse causality that you were referring to, is that poor people talking to poor people doesn't really help as much as rich people talking to rich people. And so rich people tend to do it more too.
And
Wonderful.
First
Happy
one
to send
was
you a paper.
sorry. And the first one was the drifting. Do you see any, like, when this group starts to form, they start with diverse ideas, but through interaction, some ideas try to kind of subjugate other ideas and tend to create a drift towards a more of a homogeneous kind of groups. Like
Oh yeah, that's basically this reaction diffusion thing that I was talking about, is that we have a number of sort of really interesting papers about people doing this, is that what ends up happening is these little people form into homogeneous groups, right? We all know that. But that group tends to differentiate from other people. So it tends to drift away from the other people as a way of reinforcing perhaps group membership norms and things like that. So it makes this sort of
So my
polarization, separation much more persistent than it might otherwise be.
My question was more like, does the number of different groups start to decrease? Like the diversity of different cliques itself starts to decay? Like,
Well, the math suggests that that depends on the diversity of um, situations. So what are the problems that are being solved, plus the ability to usefully interact with people, which is not just hearing information, but actually form social ties, collaborate, stuff like that. So new media, new tools give us the ability to actually collaborate better than we were 2,000 years ago. Writing gave us the ability to collaborate better than 10,000 years ago. And the situation that we have experience is different in different physical locations and different parts of the culture. So different professions, different work situations. And so all of those are, again, sort of at tension. The diversity of situation tends to isolate people, to find local solutions. The improvement in communications tends to allow people to merge a little bit. But as I showed with the online communication today, it doesn't do a very good job. It is other factors, like actual having collaborations with people that seem to do a better job of making this mixing work.
thank you for yours. That's informative.
You're muted, Professor Tas.
Yeah, I had one question. Sid, let me ask that question, then it will be sequel, because the question I had is similar. So, Sandy, you mentioned, for example, when you talked about one size fits none, like Brexit or other problems in US and everywhere, that we need to get better data. So the question is that where do you get the better data when there are human biases, where there are untruthful behaviors, and will lead to the tragedy of the commons, right? So do you have any, so how do we get the better data?
I make a distinction about subjective versus quote unquote objective. So for instance, and I'll give the example of the census. You know, the census says there's so many people that live here, here's their ages. Now, people will debate the details, but basically people trust it because it's this sort of simple, uninterpreted fact. And I think there's a lot of things like that that we could have. Like, for instance, in a neighborhood, physical neighborhood, you know the boundaries, how many people got COVID? How many people have diabetes? How many people are employed? How many people are unemployed? You don't know. And the reason you don't know is because the data is held by these large-scale institutions, government, Google, whatever, hospitals. And so you can't make sensible policy for your neighborhood because you don't know the situation. Right? If you knew the situation, you could prioritize what to do. You would know more how to begin doing it. Right? So how do you collect that data? Well, there's a lot of ways to collect it. Form a cooperative. Use existing credit unions or Chamber of Commerce or things like that. You can just do it with surveys, straight up, paper surveys or online surveys. It's not that hard. Or, and this is the things that we're doing with, say, gig workers, everybody has this data on their phone, and when it's on your phone, it's yours, regardless of the EULA, the little terms and conditions. So you can scrape it. You can take it. And so what we're doing with gig workers is they have all their orders and where they went and how much they got paid. And we're just collecting that, helping them collect that data. It's still their data. But now they have a cooperative of gig workers where they can ask, well, is everybody getting paid the same? What's the best strategy for this sort of worker? Blah, 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 blah. So they can begin knowing their situation. I think that the same thing, particularly in the midst of the pandemic, is absolutely important for neighborhoods to know, what were the background public health problems, because death seems to be very highly correlated with public health problems. What's the unemployment? Who really needs it? What is the, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And until you know those things on that sort of immediate community basis, you can't take action. And I think that one of the things that we've done over the last decades is we've tried to centralize things too much. We make a national system. We make one rule on, Google or whatever, right? But people are different. Situations are different. And I think that the evidence from governments at different sizes is that local government can be much better than global government. The global government can be good at setting, boundaries and guidelines. But in the end, it has to be local action, I think, that makes these things happen. We've seen that repeatedly over the last couple hundred years. And I think there's good reasons to believe that that's a place to look more than, getting Congress to do something, right? Or, having the UN do something or something like that.
Thank you. The Seed, you are next. Are you okay in terms of time, Sandy?
Yeah, why don't we make this the last question then?
Okay. So, Seed.
Hello, Professor Pentland. It was a wonderful talk. The question I have for you is, so I understand the solution that you're offering is bringing multiple diverse people together and have data unions among them and so on and so forth. But one of the challenges that we're facing today is people have very strong opinions, and even sustain groups which have very strong opinions is a difficult task to achieve. So the question is, how do you even, what kind of measures are needed to ensure sustainability of such data unions so that diverse groups continue to work together and we can make this progress?
Well, first of all, point out that a lot of the cooperatives that are around, for instance, in the United States today, have been around since 1930. Did you know that the majority of the US electric grid was built by cooperatives? There are people who felt like they weren't getting power and they just pooled their resources to build electrical grids. And that's 56% of the US grid. Amazing, right? So people are capable of doing these things. And you say, well, what's to keep things to be sort of the same? I'm a big believer in Darwin. Like if some community wants to have this policy, let them try it. Maybe it'll work. I don't know. Maybe it works for them, but not for me. If it doesn't work, if they have good feedback, right, they may discover very quickly that it's not working. And there are famous examples of things that didn't work, like people now believe that the broken windows policing was a very bad idea, but they didn't have any data about what it was doing. Right? They had some crime data, but the crime data is biased. They didn't have how people were feeling. They didn't have lockup numbers. They didn't have bunches of things that might have said, no, it's actually not working that well. We need to revisit this. And you can imagine lots of things like around schooling, around whatever. And, if the community decides to do it, then it's their responsibility, right? And they have to live with their decisions. That's part of the whole equation. I run a program for the last 20 years where I help people start businesses in other countries, in poor countries mostly. And, I'm a white guy and an American. It isn't my business what they decide to do. But they should decide to do something. And they should take the effort to try and make things better for themselves. And I'll give advice. Advice is free. It's probably worth that. but in the end, they have to decide and they have to do it. So we can't decide for everybody is the bottom line there. That's just my attitude. You may take a different attitude.
I totally agree with you. But what I'm saying is within a group, if you have, let's say if you have two different individuals, very strong opinions, which are opposing each other, then sometimes they're not even.
I hear you, and in which case the group may break into two. Okay. You know, if you actually have a small a community group like that, what you find is that the strong opinions tend to get marginalized because they need to get a super majority. Because there's, see, one of the things that's wrong with today's work is that it's about this issue and no other issue. So, I mean, imagine that, I don't want to get controversial here, but you had issue A, but it has all these other side effects that maybe you're not thinking about. Other people will have a view that says, hey, but wait, it's got all these side effects. So the strong opinions tend to get isolated by the multiplicity of perspectives, plus the fact that these people actually depend on each other. You can't have an action group without people trusting each other and working together. And that tends, that lack, it's that lack of reputation and accountability that often allows the extreme opinions to flourish. So anyway, I'm going to have to go. Thank you for inviting me. If I'm just Pentland at mit.edu. You know, and if you want to follow up about things, I'll try and do it. I'm super busy because this is the first day of classes. So please forgive me if I don't respond, but take care, okay?
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And I'll send you the link once I get back from the Zoom cloud.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And for everyone, if you're still there, so next Monday, we also have another National Academy of Engineering member, Professor P.R. Kumar from Texas A&M University. He was at Urbana-Champaign before moving to Texas a few years ago. His talk will be on security of cyber physical systems. Okay, so we'll see you next Monday. And don't forget, this Friday, we have another talk by an IBM fellow, IEEE fellow, IBM fellow on computer architecture. He is the chief architect of the Power platform at IBM. Okay, that's on Friday, 11 o'clock. All right, see you later.
Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you.